Okay, let's unpack this. I want to start with a sensory memory. If I say the name Radioshack, what is the immediate visceral thing that hits your brain? For me, it's a very specific smell. It's that mix of stale carpet, ozone, plastic packaging, and maybe, just maybe, a hint of burnt solder.
It's the smell of potential, or at least it used to be. For a certain generation, that smell meant you were about to build something.
Right.
For another generation, it meant you were about to overpay for a remote control car battery on a Saturday morning because you didn't have any other choice.
And for anyone following business news in the last, say, 10 years, that name just smells like, well, a dumpster fire.
A tragedy, really. I mean, it's a slow-motion car crash that somehow turned into a zombie movie.
Exactly. We're talking about Radioshack today, and I have to say, I dove into the stack of research we have, the corporate histories, the SEC filings, the endless Reddit threads from former employees, and this story is so much wilder than just Amazon killed the video stuff.
Oh, way wilder.
We're talking about a company that was once a cultural touchstone. I mean, this was the place where the personal computer revolution basically got its walking leg.
Absolutely. It was a sanctuary for nerds before nerd was a badge of honor. You have to understand the scale here.
Yeah.
At its peak, Radioshack operated over 8,000 stores in the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. They were within 5 miles of 95% of the American population.
Think about that density. That is Starbucks levels of saturation, but for capacitors and fuses.
Exactly.
And now, it's a ghost. But it's not just a ghost, it's a poltergeist. We have a story here that involves a pivot to cryptocurrency, rogue social media accounts, posting NSFW content, a CEO who lied about a theology degree.
Oh, don't forget the bankruptcy proceeding that tried to sell customer data against the will of 38 state attorneys general.
It's the ultimate case study in identity crisis.
It really is.
So the mission for this deep dive is pretty specific. We want to understand how a company that once sold more mobile phones than Walmart, Circuit City, and Best Buy combined,
Which is a crazy statistic.
and was, at one point, the world's biggest manufacturer of personal computers. How did that company collapse into this cautionary tale?
We need to figure out how you go from being America's technology store to being a punchline. And crucially, we need to look at the financials, the why behind the bad decisions, because it wasn't just bad luck.
No.
It was structural.
So let's rewind way, way back, because I think most people assume Radioshack started in the 70s or 80s, but the roots go much, much deeper. We're going back to 1921, Boston, Massachusetts.
The Roaring 20s. And we have 2 brothers, Theodore and Milton Deutschman.
Now, in 1921, they aren't selling cell phones, obviously. They are selling equipment for a brand new, almost mystical field, amateur radio.
Ham radio. And we need to pause here to explain what ham radio actually meant in 1921.
Right.
Today, we think of it as maybe something your eccentric uncle does in the basement. But in 1921, ham radio was the internet. It was the only way a regular person could communicate instantly with someone in another country without going through a government or a massive telegraph corporation.
It was the frontier.
Totally. It was the original maker community. You
Right.
weren't just buying a radio, you were building a transmitter to talk to a guy in Australia.
Right.
And the Deutschman brothers saw this. They opened a one-store retail and mail order operation. And the name they chose, Radioshack. It wasn't just a random rustic vibe. It was specific jargon.
Right. I looked this up. It's a nautical term.
It is. On a ship, the radio shack was the small wooden structure on the upper deck that housed the wireless equipment.
Wow.
It had to be up high for the antenna. It was the nerve center of the ship's communication. So by calling the store Radio Shack, they were signaling to radio officers and hardcore hobbyists, this is where your gear is, this is your command center.
That is fascinating. So it wasn't just a shack in the sense of a rundown hut. It was a technical term.
Mm-hmm.
But looking at the early history, it wasn't all smooth sailing. In those Boston days, the store had a bit of a, let's call it a reputation.
It did. And not necessarily a glowing one. Among the locals and some of the more snobbish audiophiles, it was disparagingly nicknamed Nagasaki hardware.
Oof, Nagasaki hardware. That sounds loaded, especially given the time period.
It was very loaded. You have to remember the era. Post-World War II, Japanese manufacturing was perceived very differently than it is today.
Right, it wasn't Sony.
No, it wasn't the high-quality Sony or Nintendo or Toyota standard we know now. It was seen as cheap, low-quality, mass-produced junk. And Radio Shack sourced a lot of their parts from Japan to keep costs down.
So they were the budget option, the place you went for the cheap stuff when you couldn't afford the American or German parts.
Exactly, but they were innovating too. In 1954, they started their own private label called Realist to sell high-fidelity music equipment.
Realist.
They later changed it to Realistic after a lawsuit, but that brand Realistic would become legendary.
Oh, yeah. I definitely had a Realistic cassette player growing up. It was a generic brand that everyone had. But despite the mail-order success and expanding to 9 stores, by the early 1960s, the Deutschmans were in trouble.
They had overextended, they had ambitious plans, a fancy headquarters near Boston University, but the financials just weren't adding up.
They were running out of money.
They were basically bankrupt. They had about $14 million in today's money worth of debt. And that is where the story truly begins. That is where we meet the man who would turn this Nagasaki hardware into a retail empire.
Enter Charles D. Tandy. Now, looking at his background, this doesn't make sense on paper. He wasn't an engineer, he wasn't a radio guy, he was a leather guy.
Charles Tandy. He was a genius, frankly. He ran Tandy Leather. They sold leathercraft kits, moccasins, belts, wallets that you would stitch together yourself.
So he was in the hobby business.
Precisely. And that is the key connection. He understood the psychology of the hobbyist. He knew that people like to build things with their hands. He was looking for other hobbyist businesses to expand into. He saw Radioshack, saw the potential in consumer electronics, and bought the failing company in 1962 for $300,000.
$300,000. That is pennies. It's the price of a small house today.
It's an absolute steal.
So, a leather guy buys a radio store. Did he try to sell leather cases for the radios?
He did, actually. But the real revolution was his business strategy. He looked at the books and realized the mail order business was losing money due to the costs of credit, people not paying their bills and shipping.
Right.
So he pivoted. He closed the mail order side and went all in on physical retail, but not just any retail.
This is the famous holes in the wall strategy.
Holes in the wall. The conventional wisdom at the time for electronics was to build big, impressive showrooms where you could display the giant console TVs and hi-fi systems. Tandy went the opposite direction.
Going small.
He wanted many, many small locations, rented storefronts and strip malls, old buildings, anywhere with foot traffic.
So why go small? What was the advantage?
2 reasons. Density and flexibility. By keeping the store small and the rent low, he could afford to saturate a neighborhood. If you have a store every 3 miles, you become the default option. And because they were rented shells with minimal build-out, if a location didn't work, he could close it and move it down the street with almost no loss.
It's the fail-fast methodology before Silicon Valley invented the term.
Exactly. But the real genius, and this is the business school case study part, was the inventory management and the vertical integration.
Right, vertical integration. This is a term we hear a lot, usually regarding companies like Apple or Tesla today. But Radioshack was doing this in the 60s.
Yeah, way ahead of the curve. Tandy cut the inventory from 40,000 items down to 2,500.
Wow.
He applied the 80-20 rule before it was trendy. He identified the 20% of items that represented 80% of the sales batteries, wires, tubes, simple radios, and got rid of the esoteric stuff.
He focused on the hits.
And crucially, he replaced name brand products with private label items.
So instead of selling RCA cables, they sold Radioshack cables.
Even better, they sold Realistic cables or Archer antennas or Mycona test equipment. These were all Radioshack brands. And here's the kicker. Radioshack didn't just brand them, they manufactured them. They owned the factories.
Okay, let's break down the economics of that. Why does owning the factory matter so much for a store like this?
It's all about the margin. I mean, all of it. Let's say you sell a Sony radio. Sony makes the radio, they take a profit. The distributor ships it, they take a profit. You sell it, you get a small slice at the end, maybe 15 or 20%.
Right.
But if you make the wire in your own factory for 10 cents and you sell it in your store for $5...
You keep the whole $4.90.
Exactly. The margins on those small parts, the cables, the connectors, the fuses, were astronomical. 1,000% markups sometimes.
1,000%.
That is why they could afford to have 8,000 stores. They weren't making money on the big ticket items. They were making money on the bits and pieces that you couldn't find anywhere else.
So they're making their own stuff, selling it in their own tiny stores, and they're everywhere. But you still need to get people into the store.
Of course.
You can have the best margins in the world, but if nobody walks in, you die. And this brings us to one of the most brilliant and frankly nostalgic marketing schemes of the 20th century.
The Battery of the Month Club.
Yes. I remember this. My dad had this card in his wallet for years. It was like a sacred object.
It ran from the 60s all the way to the 90s. It was the ultimate loss leader program. You got a wallet-sized card, which, by the way, doubled as a business card for the store with the address and phone number.
Huh?
And it entitled you to one free Cell battery every single month.
Just one free battery. Not a pack. Just one.
Just one. A 9-volt, a AA, a C-cell. But think about the psychology. First, you have this card in your wallet. It's a prominent billboard in your pocket. Second, nobody goes to the store just to get one AA battery and leaves. You go in, you grab your free battery, and then you look around. Oh, I need a cable for the TV, or I need a new fuse, or, hey, look at that remote control car.
It turned the store into a habit, a monthly ritual.
It drove consistent foot traffic for decades. And because they made the batteries themselves, again, vertical integration, the cost of that free battery to them was pennies.
So it was basically free marketing.
It was the cheapest customer acquisition cost in history. Just brilliant.
It's genius. And speaking of genius products, we have to talk about the Flavor Radio. This was in the notes, and I just love the whimsy of it.
The realistic Flavor Radio. It had the longest production run in radio history, from 1972 to 2000.
Oh, wow.
These were simple AM-only portable radios, but the hook was the colors. They came in flavors: strawberry, avocado, plum, vanilla, chocolate.
An avocado radio. That is the most 1970s sentence I have ever heard.
It is perfectly 70s, but it shows that Tandy understood that electronics could be fun, personal, and cheap enough to be an impulse buy. It wasn't just serious gear for ham radio operators anymore. It was pop culture.
But the real game changer wasn't avocado radios. We have to talk about 1977. The personal computer revolution. This is where Radioshack goes from hardware store to tech giant.
The TRS-80. This is a monumental moment. 1977 is often called the 1977 Trinity in computing history. You had the Apple II, the Commodore PT, and the TRS-80.
And the TRS-80 was the Radioshack offering. Now, for our younger listeners or those who didn't live through this, describe this machine. What are we looking at?
It was a gray, chunky keyboard that contained the computer itself, hooked up to a standard black and white TV monitor and a cassette tape recorder for storage.
A cassette tape?
A cassette tape. And it had 4 kilobytes of RAM.
4 kilobytes. My email signature is bigger than 4 kilobytes.
It is. But at the time, this was magic. And unlike the Altair, which was a kit you had to solder together yourself and hope it worked,
Red box of parts.
the TRS-80 came fully assembled. You plugged it in, you typed a command, and it worked. It cost $600.
Which was a lot of money then, about $3,000 today, but compared to a mainframe or a business computer.
It was accessible, and Radioshack had a massive advantage over Apple and Commodore. They had 3,000 stores ready to sell it on day one. Apple had a garage and a few local dealers.
So they dominated the market.
They did. For a few years, the TRS-80 was the best-selling computer in the world. They created a whole ecosystem. They had comic books.
No way.
Tandy Computer Whiz Kids, where the Whiz Kids would team up with Superman or Archie to solve crimes using their TRS-80s.
Superman and the Tandy Whiz Kids. That is amazing. Quick, Superman, I need to load this cassette tape to calculate the villain's trajectory. It will only take 45 minutes.
It sounds funny now, but it normalized computers for a generation of kids. And we have to mention the Forrest Mims notebooks here, too.
Oh, right. The engineer's mini notebooks.
These were little books sold at Radioshack, written by Forrest Mims. They were hand-drawn. The schematics looked like they were sketched on graph paper.
I remember those.
They taught you how to build circuits, how to use a 555 timer, how to build a light sensor. They were approachable. They didn't feel like textbooks. They felt like field guides.
Yeah.
This cemented Radioshack as the school for the maker generation.
But even with all that success, the cracks were starting to show. I recall the nickname, the Trash 80.
Yes. The Trash 80. It was affectionate for some, derogatory for others. The build quality was okay, but the real problem was the proprietary nature. As the 80s went on, the world moved toward the IBM PC standard. Radioshack eventually pivoted to making IBM clones, but the margins were shrinking. Competitors like Dell and Gateway were coming up, selling direct to consumers.
This leads us into the 90s. The golden age is ending. The Tandy era is winding down. And Radioshack starts to undergo this identity crisis.
This is the pivotal moment. In the early 90s, they made a strategic decision that, in hindsight, was the beginning of the end.
What was it?
They decided to get out of the making business. They sold off their manufacturing divisions. They stopped making their own computers. They sold Memorex. They decided to stop being a vertically integrated manufacturer and focus solely on being a retailer.
They gave up their superpower. the thing that gave them those 1,000% margins.
Exactly. They voluntarily gave up their moat, and they shifted their focus from hobbyist components, the weird wires and fuses you couldn't get anywhere else, to the new hotness. Wireless phones.
Mobile phones. The boom of the late 90s and early 2000s. I mean, on paper, that sounds smart. Everyone is buying cell phones. Why not sell them?
It seemed smart at the time. It made the stock price go up in the short term. But here's the danger. They went from selling exclusive private label goods to selling third-party plans. Verizon, Sprint, AT&T.
Which you could buy anywhere.
You could buy them at Best Buy, at a carrier store, eventually at Walmart, at Costco. Radioshack became a middleman. And when you are a middleman selling a commodity product, you have no pricing power. You are just competing on who has the better strip mall location.
And they tried to fix this middleman problem with some really interesting experiments. We have to talk about Incredible Universe.
Oh, Incredible Universe. 1992. This was Tandy's attempt to out Best Buy. They launched big box electronics stores. And when I say big, I mean gigantic. These were 160,000 square foot warehouses.
For context, a typical Radio Shack was like 2,500 square feet.
Right. These places were massive. They had DJs, karaoke stages, restaurants inside the store. It was like a theme park for electronics.
Come for the TV, stay for the laser show.
Essentially. But the economics were a disaster. It was too big, too expensive to run, and the inventory costs were crushing. Most of the stores never turned a profit. They eventually sold the profitable ones to Fry's Electronics, another fallen giant, and closed the rest.
Billion-dollar mistake. So the big box idea failed. Then they had the Repair Shop Initiative in 1994, trying to repair out-of-warranty electronics.
Which theoretically makes sense for Radio Shack, right? We fix things. Executives thought it would generate $500 million a year. But think about the logistics. You are promising to fix any electronic device, a Sony Walkman, a Panasonic VCR, a Toshiba TV.
Right.
You need parts for thousands of different models. You need technicians who know how to fix everything. It just didn't scale. It was a logistical nightmare.
And then there is the cat.
Yeah.
We cannot do this deep dive without talking about the Q-Cat.
The Q-Cat. The year 2000. This is peak dot-com bubble insanity. Radio Shack invested $35 million in this. It was a barcode reader shaped like a cat.
A literal plastic cat.
A plastic cat with a red LED nose, that was the scanner. The idea was you would be reading a magazine, you'd see an ad for, say, a Ford truck.
Yep.
You would take your plastic cat, which was wired to your computer, and scan a barcode on the ad. And then Your web browser would open the Ford website.
Instead of just typing in Ford.com.
Exactly. It was a solution looking for a problem. But think about the user experience friction here. You are reading a magazine on your couch. Your computer is on a desk in the other room. You have to bring a magazine to the desk, wake up the computer, find the cat, scan the code.
And the cat had a cord. It wasn't wireless.
It wasn't wireless. It plugged into the PS2 keyboard port. It was clunky, it was creepy, and it was a massive privacy nightmare because it tracked what you were scanning. It became a punchline in the tech world.
It showed a company that was desperate to be on the cutting edge, but had completely lost touch with how humans actually use technology.
Totally.
And amidst all this, the branding started to get shaky. They went from America's technology store to, you've got questions, we've got answers.
Which was a good slogan, actually. You've got questions, we've got answers. It emphasized their knowledgeable staff.
But was it true?
Well, there's a disconnect. As they cut training budgets to save money, and as they focused entirely on selling cell phone contracts, the staff became less knowledgeable about electronics and more aggressive about sales. So you had questions about a capacitor, but they didn't have answers. They had a question for you. What carrier are you with?
And then the ultimate cringe moment, the 2009 rebrand.
Yeah.
The Shack.
The Shack. Oh, man. They tried to rebrand as just the Shack. It was a desperate attempt to appear cool and youthful, but it alienated their core demographic, the tinkerers, the older hobbyists, without actually attracting the cool kids.
Right.
It's like your dad putting on a backwards baseball cap, sitting on a chair backwards and saying, let's rap about connectivity.
It reeks of insecurity. So we have failed experiments, a confusing brand identity, and a shift to low-margin cell phones. But underneath the surface, there was something even more toxic brewing. The corporate culture was rotting.
This brings us to the mid-2000s. The management malpractice here is stunning. First, you have the resume scandal with CEO David Edmondson.
Well, right. the guy who invented his own degree.
In 2006, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram did some digging. They revealed that Edmondson lied about having degrees in theology and psychology. He didn't have them.
It's never a good look when your CEO is lying about his credentials.
Yeah.
It suggests a certain looseness with the truth at the top.
It does. He resigned. And then they brought in Julian C. Day as CEO. Now, Julian Day was a financial engineer. He had no frontline retail experience. He was a cost cutter.
Okay.
The Consumerists later named him one of the 10 crappiest CEOs.
That is a title you do not want on your tombstone. What did he do that was so bad?
He treated employees like line items on a spreadsheet to be deleted. There was a program called Fix 1500.
Fix 1500. It sounds like a repair program for radios.
It was a purge.
Yeah.
In 2004, setting the stage for this culture, they identified the bottom 1,500 store managers. But they didn't just grade them on sales data. They graded them on subjective interviews with district management.
Oh, no.
It created a survivor-style culture. If your boss didn't like you, you were out. 1,734 managers were reassigned or fired in 6 months. It created a culture of fear.
I can imagine.
But the low point, the absolute nadir of employee relations, happened in August 2006. The email layoff.
I remember reading about this. It sounds dystopian. Walk us through that morning.
Imagine it's a Tuesday morning. You work at the headquarters in Fort Worth. You get an email notification. Subject line, workforce reduction notification. You open it. It basically says, your position has been eliminated. You have 30 minutes to pack your personal effects and leave the building.
30 minutes. That's an eviction, not a layoff.
30 minutes. And get this, the company withheld their severance packages immediately to ensure they returned their company-issued BlackBerries before they walked out the door.
What?
Give us the phone, or you don't get paid.
That is incredibly cruel. It's dehumanizing.
It was. And the public backlash was immediate. It showed a company that viewed its people as liabilities, not assets. If you treat your HQ staff like that, imagine how the store employees felt.
And while they were firing people by email to save pennies, what were they doing with their capital? Because companies usually fire people to save money to invest in something else.
They were investing in anything productive.
Were they investing in e-commerce? Were they building the next Arduino?
No. They were doing financial engineering, specifically stock buybacks. Between 2000 and 2011, Radioshack spent $2.6 billion buying back its own stock.
$2.6 billion. Okay,
No.
Explain this for the non-finance listeners. Why do companies buy their own stock?
Theoretically, it's to return value to shareholders. If you reduce the number of shares available, the earnings per share goes up, and the stock price usually rises.
Okay.
It makes the executives, who are paid in stock options, very rich in the short term.
But it doesn't actually make the company better. It doesn't build a new factory or design a new product.
Correct. It's artificial inflation. That $2.6 billion could have been used to pivot to online retail. They could have bought MakerBot. They could have built a competitor to Amazon for electronics components. They could have reinvented the maker movement. Instead, they lit that money on fire to prop up the stock price. And it worked for a while. The stock was over $20. But eventually, reality catches up. The stock fell to under $1. That capital just evaporated.
That is infuriating. So they have no money, bad morale, and customers hate them. I saw the Temkin Group ratings regarding customer service.
Yes. For 6 consecutive years, Radioshack was ranked as the retailer with the worst overall customer experience.
6 years in a row.
Think about that. Worse than the DMV. Worse than cable companies.
Why? What was so bad?
Because of the pressure. Employees were under immense pressure to sell mobile contracts. If you walked in looking for a fuse or a capacitor, the core Radioshack customer, you were ignored because there was no commission on a 50-cent fuse. But if you looked like you might buy a Sprint plan, they swarmed you like sharks. It became an unpleasant place to be.
Which brings us to the slow motion collapse, 2012 to 2015. This is the death spiral.
By 2011, smartphones accounted for half of their revenue. But the margins were razor thin. They were losing money on every transaction once you factored in overhead. They needed to shrink. They had too many holes in the wall.
Right.
They needed to close about 1,100 stores to survive.
So close them. That was the original strategy, right? Flexibility.
But they couldn't. And this is a fascinating piece of financial tragedy. In 2013, they ran out of cash. They got a $250 million loan from a group called Salus Capital.
Okay.
But lenders aren't charities. This was a distressed loan. It came with onerous conditions.
What kind of conditions?
The loan was an asset-based loan. The collateral for the loan was the inventory in the stores. If Radioshack closed a store and liquidated the inventory, the value of the collateral would drop.
Ah, I see where this is going.
If the collateral drops, the bank calls the loan.
So the bank specifically blocked them from closing stores.
Yes. The contract said they couldn't close more than 200 stores a year, but they needed to close 1,100, so they were trapped.
That's a death trap.
They were forced to keep unprofitable stores open, paying rent and salaries, just to keep the inventory on the shelves to satisfy the bank. By late 2014, they were losing $1.1 million per day.
$1 million a day. Just bleeding out.
It was unsustainable. They tried everything. Thanksgiving 2014, they tried to stay open from 8 a.m. to midnight.
On Thanksgiving. That's desperate.
It caused a revolt. Employees quit. Customers were angry about the commercialization of the holiday, and the sales were actually lower than the previous year. It was the final gasp.
And so in 2015, bankruptcy number 1 happens.
They filed Chapter 11, delisted from the NYSE. And this is an important distinction for our listeners. The Radioshack that emerged from this bankruptcy was not the same company.
Right.
It was bought by a hedge fund called Standard General, operating as General Wireless. The chief marketing officer at the time explicitly stated that the old Radioshack was defunct.
It was a zombie.
A zombie wearing the skin of Radioshack. They made a deal with Sprint to turn the stores into co-branded locations. The mock-ups showed Sprint branding dominating everything. It wasn't Radioshack anymore. It was a Sprint store with a few batteries in the back corner.
And even in bankruptcy, they managed to court controversy. The customer data sale. This one really riled people up.
Right. When a company goes bankrupt, they sell their assets. Desks, chairs, inventory. But Radioshack tried to sell its customer list. The personal data of 67 million customers. Names, addresses, purchase history.
After promising for years on little signs in the store, we will never sell your data.
Exactly. It was a final betrayal of trust. 38 state attorneys general had to step in and fight it in court. They eventually reached a settlement where most of the data was destroyed, but the attempt showed just how far they had fallen.
So 2015 happens. They are technically still alive as General Wireless, but the suffering wasn't over.
No, not even close. The Sprint partnership was a disaster. Bankruptcy number 2 came just 2 years later in 2017. General Wireless filed for Chapter 11. They started closing stores aggressively this time, and this is where we get the rogue Facebook posts.
Oh, I saw this in the research.
Yeah.
This was from a store in Reynoldsburg, Ohio.
Yes. Imagine you are following your local Radioshack on Facebook. One day, a post pops up. We closed. F you all.
Wow. No asterisks.
No asterisks. It went viral instantly. Corporate had to deny involvement, obviously, but it captured the mood of the employees perfectly. They felt abandoned. They felt used.
And there was a lawsuit against Sprint, too, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't just incompetence. There was an accusation of sabotage.
Yes. The creditors sued Sprint. They claimed that Sprint used the Radioshack co-branded stores as a Trojan horse.
How so?
They alleged that Sprint used the Radioshack sales data to figure out exactly where the best customers lived, and then built new, standalone Sprint stores right next door to the best-performing Radioshacks.
Cannibalizing them.
Destroying them. They claimed this tactic killed 6,000 Radioshack jobs. It was a messy, ugly end to the retail giant.
So the carcass of Radioshack is picked clean. The stores are empty, the sign is taken down, and then 2020 happens, and things get weird.
The RV era. Retail e-commerce ventures. These are investors who buy dead brands like Pier 1, Models, Linens, and things, and try to run them as online-only zombie brands.
Right.
They bought the Radioshack IP.
And they decided the future of Radioshack, a company known for soldering irons and batteries, was
Cryptocurrency?
Radioshack Defy. In December 2021, the website suddenly changed. It was no longer selling parts. It was announcing a cryptocurrency platform to swap tokens. They launched a token called Radio.
I can't connect with dots. How do you go from the TRS-80 to a liquidity pool?
You don't. That's the point. It was pure arbitrage. They were using a trusted, nostalgic brand name to give legitimacy to a crypto project. The theory was that because Radioshack was an old brand, it would make crypto feel safe for older generations.
Wow.
Oh, Grandma knows Radioshack. Maybe she will buy this token.
That is incredibly cynical. It is. And to generate hype, they adopted a very strange Twitter strategy. In June 2022, the brand's verified Twitter account began posting NSFW content.
Not safe for work?
Edgy, vulgar jokes. Drugs, sex, insults.
To attract who? Crypto bros.
Presumably. The edgelord marketing strategy.
Yeah.
But it backfired spectacularly with their few remaining real-world partners. Hobbytown USA, a chain of hobby stores that had a partnership to sell Radioshack parts in their aisles, terminated the relationship immediately.
Yeah, I can see why.
They were like, we are a family hobby store. We sell model trains. We can't be associated with a Twitter account posting about bodily fluids.
So they alienated the last remaining connection to their hobbyist roots to chase a crypto trend that was already crashing.
It was the final identity crisis, a 100-year-old brand reduced to a shill for a digital token.
And here's the twist. The story doesn't end in the crypto gutter.
Right, because while the U.S. version was setting itself on fire on Twitter, something else was happening internationally.
We have to remember that Radioshack was a global brand.
Yes, and in Latin America, it never died. In fact, it never even really struggled.
Wait, really? While the U.S. stores were closing, the ones in Mexico were fine.
Perfectly fine. A group called Unicomer, based in El Salvador, had bought the rights for Latin America and the Caribbean years ago, and another group, Grupo Gigante, owned the business in Mexico. They operated independently.
And were they pivoting to crypto and firing people via email?
No, they were just running electronic stores. They sold phones, yes, but they also sold TVs, stereos, parts. They were profitable. They were opening new stores. While the U.S. chain was imploding, Radioshack in El Salvador was a premier retailer.
That is incredible. So the DNA of the company survived by leaving the country.
And in May 2023, the ultimate irony occurred. Unicomer Group, the franchise, acquired control of the worldwide Radioshack business, including the U.S. intellectual property.
So the franchise bought the franchisor. The child saved the parent.
Essentially, Unicomer now owns the brand. They stripped away the crypto nonsense immediately, and they have signaled a potential return to traditional retail roots.
That is a glimmer of hope. So let's bring this all together. We've gone from ham radio to the golden age of the TRS-80, to the cell phone kiosk era, to the bankruptcy zombie years, and now back to international ownership. When you look at this entire arc, what is the big business lesson?
If we look at the big picture, the fatal flaw was abandoning the maker community. Radioshack was built on the backs of people who wanted to build, fix, and understand technology.
The people who knew what a capacitor was. The people who bought the Forrest Mims notebooks.
Exactly. When Radioshack chased the generic mobile phone market, they became just another middleman. They stopped offering value. They stopped being a destination. In a world of Amazon, you can't survive by selling the same thing as everyone else at a higher price.
You have to offer something else.
You have to offer expertise and exclusivity.
It's tragic because if you look at the last 10 years, the maker movement has been huge. 3D printing, Arduino, Raspberry Pi, drone building.
That is the great what if. Imagine if Radioshack hadn't spent 20 years trying to be a Verizon kiosk. Imagine if they had become the hub for the maker movement, a place where you could go to learn 3D printing, buy Arduino kits, get your broken iPhone screen fixed by an expert who actually teaches you how to do it.
The right to repair movement is massive right now. People are tired of disposable tech. Radioshack could have been the headquarters for that revolution.
They had the real estate, they had the brand heritage, they just didn't have the vision. They chased the quick buck of the cell phone contract, the financial engineering play, and lost their soul in the process.
It really makes you think about the importance of knowing who your customer actually is.
And respecting them. You can't hate your customer or your employees and expect to survive for 100 years.
So next time I need a battery, I'm going to think about that wallet-sized card, the smell of ozone, and what could have been.
And maybe, just maybe, with the new ownership, we might see a soldering iron on the shelf again one day.
We can dream. That's it for this deep dive into the rise and fall of Radioshack. Thanks for listening, and stay curious.
Goodbye.